Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story that will test the limits of love. What would you do if your own mother asked you to take your child away and leave the woman you love behind? Stay with me to discover the choice that changes everything. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The moment didn't begin with raised voices. It began with a quiet knock. Soft, measured, almost too calm for what it carried. The CEO glanced at the door, then back at Tieu Lac, who was sitting beside the baby's bed, gently rocking her arms as if the rhythm alone could protect something so fragile. "I'll be right back," he said quietly. She nodded, not looking at him, because her eyes were still fixed on the child. Always. He stepped out, and the moment the door closed behind him, everything changed. The corridor was empty, silent, but not peaceful. At the far end, his mother stood waiting, perfectly composed, dressed as always with quiet elegance, and in her hand, a thin envelope, white, still, but heavier than anything it seemed to contain. He stopped a few steps away. "What is it?" His voice was low, careful, because something in the air already told him this was not a simple conversation. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him, long, as if measuring how much of her son was still hers. Then she held out the envelope. The result came this morning. His chest tightened. He didn't reach for it right away. Didn't need to, because he already knew what it was. DNA, proof, truth. Or at least, what she called truth. You went ahead with it anyway. Not a question, a statement. She tilted her head slightly. "I don't rely on feelings." A pause. "I rely on facts." The words were clean, sharp, without hesitation. He finally took the envelope. His fingers felt heavier than usual, as if even touching it meant stepping into something he couldn't undo. He opened it. Slowly, his eyes moved across the page. One line, one confirmation. Clear, undeniable. The baby was his. The silence stretched. His mother watched him carefully, waiting, not for the result, but for his reaction. He folded the paper once, then again, calm, too calm. "She's my daughter." There was no doubt in his voice, no surprise, only certainty. His mother nodded slightly. As expected. A pause. "Now we can move forward." But something in her tone didn't sit right. He looked up. "What do you mean?" And that was when the real conversation began. She stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough to lower her voice. "Bring the baby back to the city." The words landed quietly, but heavily. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And Tieu Lac?" A brief silence. Then, "I'll arrange for her." Arrange, such a simple word, but it carried something cold, controlled, final. He didn't speak, he just waited. Because he knew she wasn't finished. "I will prepare a compensation." Her voice remained steady. A fair amount, enough for her to start over. Start over. The phrase echoed, as if everything that had happened could be reduced to a transaction. He stared at her, not angry, not yet, just still. "You're asking me to separate them." She didn't react. "I'm asking you to do what's best." "For who?" This time, there was an edge in his voice, barely there, but real. "For the child." Her answer came immediately, without hesitation. "The baby needs proper care, the best doctors, the best environment." A pause. "And that is not here." The words were logical, clean, hard to argue with, but logic wasn't the problem. He looked at her, and her mother. A longer pause this time. Then, "She doesn't belong in your world." There it was, not hidden, not softened. The truth she had been holding back, or maybe the truth she had always believed. She comes from nothing. Her gaze didn't waver, no background, No status, no protection. Another step closer. Do you really think she can raise your child? The question hung between them, sharp, unforgiving, and beneath it, something deeper, judgment. Inside the room, Tieu Lac didn't know. Not yet. She sat quietly, the baby resting lightly against her chest now, small breaths brushing against her skin. Warm, alive, real. Her fingers moved gently across the baby's back, slow, careful, as if memorizing every detail. "You're safe," she whispered. But her voice carried something else, a hesitation, a feeling she couldn't explain, because even in this quiet moment, something didn't feel settled, as if peace had arrived too suddenly, and might leave just as quickly. Back in the corridor, the CEO exhaled slowly. "You think money can fix this?" His voice had changed now, not loud but colder. His mother didn't flinch. "I think reality requires decisions." A pause. "And this is one of them." He looked down at the folded paper in his hand, then back at her. "She almost lost the child." His voice dropped. "She went through everything, alone. She made her choices." The reply came without hesitation. "And now you must make yours." Silence, thick, heavy. Because now, there was no more space for misunderstanding. This was not about doubt anymore, not about proof, not about truth. It was about control, and what he would do with it. "Take the baby to the city," she continued, more direct now. "We will provide everything she needs." "And Tieu Lac?" he asked again, slower this time, as if forcing her to say it. "She will be taken care of." Not the answer, not really. He let out a quiet breath. "You mean, removed?" She didn't respond, but she didn't deny it either, and that was enough. The space between them shifted, something invisible, but undeniable. Because for the first time, he wasn't standing in front of his mother as her son. He was standing in front of her, as someone making a choice. Inside the room, the baby stirred slightly, a small sound escaped. Tieu Lac smiled faintly. "You're hungry again." She adjusted her position, carefully, her movements slower now, more aware, because everything mattered, every touch, every second. She didn't know what was happening outside, didn't know what was being decided, but somehow her heart tightened, just slightly, as if something unseen was approaching. Back in the corridor, the CEO finally spoke, quiet but firm. "She's not going anywhere." His mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the baby?" He didn't hesitate. "Stays with her." Silence, not shocked, not surprised, but colder. "You're choosing her." This time, it was a statement, not a question. He met her gaze. "I'm choosing my family." A pause, both of them. Her expression hardened. "Then you're choosing wrong." The words came sharp, clean, like a final cut. But he didn't move, didn't step back, didn't look away. Because somewhere between everything they had gone through, something inside him had already decided, and it wasn't going to change. The corridor felt smaller now, tighter, as if even the walls were listening. His mother took a slow breath, then nodded once, very slightly. "Then don't expect my support." The words were calm, but absolute, a line drawn, clear, irreversible. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. Not between them, not today. Inside the room, the baby made another small sound. Tieu Lac leaned down slightly, her voice soft. "I'm here." And for a moment, everything was quiet again. But not for long, because outside that fragile peace, a decision had already been made, and the consequences were just beginning. The silence after her words didn't fade. It settled, heavy, permanent. The CEO stood there for a long moment, as if something inside him had just closed a door he could never reopen again. His mother had already turned away. Not in anger, not in disappointment, but in something colder. Acceptance, the kind that comes when someone decides you are no longer worth convincing. "Then we're done here," she said quietly. No raised voice, no final argument, just a conclusion. And somehow, that made it hurt more. He didn't follow her, didn't call her back. He just stood there, the folded DNA result still in his hand, feeling its weight in a way paper should never feel. Because that page didn't just confirm a child, it drew a line between two worlds. And he had just chosen one. When he walked back into the room, Tieu Lac didn't look up immediately. She was still focused on the baby, still whispering softly, still holding on to that fragile moment as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. But something in the way he entered made her pause. She looked up slowly. Their eyes met. And she knew, not the details, not the words, but the feeling. Something happened. Her voice was soft, but certain. He didn't answer right away. He closed the door gently behind him, walked toward her, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at her, at the baby, at the life he had chosen. Then he spoke. "My mother wants to take the baby back to the city." Tieu Lac's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. "And me?" She didn't ask it with fear, she asked it with clarity, because she already understood. He didn't lie. "She wants to arrange a life for you, somewhere else." A pause. "With money." Silence filled the room, not explosive, not dramatic, but deep. The kind of silence that comes when something expected finally arrives. Tieu Lac lowered her eyes. For a moment, she said nothing. Because what could she say? That she was surprised? No. That she was hurt? Of course. But not in the way people expect. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't loud. It was familiar. Like a quiet confirmation of something she had always known deep down. "That's fair," she said finally, her voice calm, too calm. The CEO's expression changed instantly. "No." He stepped closer. "That's not fair." She looked at him again, her eyes steady. "It is." A small pause. "I don't belong in your world." The words came easily, as if she had rehearsed them long before this moment ever came. "And your child deserves the best." That part hurt more, because she meant it. Not as sacrifice, but as truth. The CEO shook his head immediately. "She deserves her mother." A silence followed, long, fragile. Tieu Lac looked down at the baby again. Her fingers moved gently across the small blanket. "She'll still have one." Her voice softened. "Just not me." The words barely made it out, but they landed, hard, final, and something inside him snapped. "No." This time, his voice was firm, not loud, but unbreakable. "That's not happening." She looked up, and for the first time, there was something different in her eyes. Not acceptance, not calm, but conflict. Because part of her wanted to believe him, and another part was already preparing to let go. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I do." He cut in, faster, stronger. "I understand exactly what's happening." He stepped closer, close enough that there was no space left between them. "My mother is offering control." A pause. "And you're trying to turn it into sacrifice." Her breath caught, because he was right, and she knew it. But knowing something doesn't always make it easier to fight. "I don't want her to suffer," she said quietly. "Then don't let her lose her mother." The words came without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. And for the first time, Tieu Lac didn't have an answer. The baby stirred again, a soft sound, a small movement, and both of them looked down instantly. Because in the end, everything came back to this. Her, alive, fragile, waiting. Not for decisions, but for care, for presence, for love. Tieu Lac leaned down slightly, her voice trembling now. I don't want to lose her. The truth finally broke through, raw, unfiltered, and that was all it took. The CEO reached out, gently, carefully, and placed his hand over hers. You won't. A pause. As long as I'm here, you won't. The words were simple, but this time, they weren't just comfort, they were a promise. Outside the room, his mother hadn't left. She stood at the end of the corridor again, waiting, not impatiently, not nervously, just waiting. Because she knew a decision like this doesn't happen in one moment. It unfolds, slowly, under pressure, until something breaks. The man in the suit stood beside her again, quiet, invisible. Should we proceed? He asked softly. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained on the closed door. Inside, her son. That girl, that child, everything tangled together in a way she had never planned for. Not yet. The words came slowly, measured. Let him choose. A pause. But be ready. The man nodded. Yes, madam. Because whether the choice came willingly or had to be forced, she would not lose control again. Inside, the room felt smaller now. Not physically, but emotionally, because everything had narrowed down to one truth. Stay together, or be pulled apart. Tieu Lac looked at him again, her eyes softer now, but still uncertain. What if we can't win? The question wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was real. Because love doesn't always win. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, carefully, and touched the baby's tiny hand. So small, so fragile, but holding on. Then he looked back at her. Then we don't fight to win. A pause. We fight to stay. Silence. And in that silence, something shifted, not outside, not in the world, but inside her. Because for the first time, this wasn't about choosing the right path, or the safe one. It was about choosing not to let go. Tieu Lac took a slow breath, her fingers tightened slightly around his. Then, she nodded. Not fully, not without fear, but enough. I'll stay. The words were quiet, but they changed everything. Outside, his mother turned slightly, as if she had already felt it. The shift, the decision, the resistance. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Then we begin, she murmured softly, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with certainty. Because if they had chosen to stay, then she would choose to act. Inside the room, the baby made another small sound, and this time, neither of them looked afraid, because no matter what came next, they had made their choice, together. But the real question was only just beginning. How far would they have to go to protect it? Tieu Lac and the CEO face a heartbreaking choice when his mother arrives with a DNA result confirming the baby is his, but demands the child be taken to the city while offering money for Tieu Lac to leave. Despite the baby's fragile condition, the pressure to separate them grows stronger. Tieu Lac, believing she doesn't belong in his world, considers stepping away for the child's future. However, the CEO refuses to accept this and firmly chooses both Tieu Lac and their baby, standing against his mother for the first time. As emotions clash and hidden power struggles begin to unfold, the couple realizes that their fight is no longer just about love, but about protecting their family from forces determined to tear them apart once again.